So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today we're going to be on another map which someone made relatively recently just after the patch came out, and it's called the East Road, which is a sort of field battle with a little bit more of a focus around more narrower engagements. There is a more open section of the field over here, but even over here in this wider open section you can see that it does sort of tend to funnel into these smaller areas, and the map is broken up into these sections. So it's not really a traditional field battle where everything is just flat, so there are going to be a few things that we have to watch out for. For example, the team that I am on, because I'm in this battle, can retreat up onto this higher ground over here, as well as, there's a few little terrain features back here that perhaps we could retreat into. Also, we have the valley in which the road cuts its way through, which there is going to be some very fast fighting happening over here. There is a mountain pathway which leads back over here as well, although that part of the map is not going to see any use today because it would take far too long for anyone to retreat back over here. And you can see that the deployment zones on this map, I don't feel as though the red team was supposed to have the ability to deploy over here. I don't think that was in the map maker's intentions, but deploy on this side of the cliffs they have. So we'll get on to that in just a moment. We'll start off with our team, actually, with the blue team, and we have two Dorwinian armies today. Eclipse 2500 and Sin of the Dark Cloud are both going to be playing as Dorwinian, which Dorwinian are a rather interesting faction. The fact that they have a small roster is something you do have to consider. But also they do have a lot of very nasty tools. Their human units are a very solid core, as I've mentioned before, but also their elven units are very varied in their strengths. In particular, the fact that they can have hidden cavalry, which is very high damage, as well as very nice poison archers as well. It's a lot of good strengths that Dorwinian have. You just have to build your army correctly so you can defend those strengths for the opportune moment. Eclipse has got some Elvelyn infantry up here on the mountain road, and the rest of his army is down here on the lower ground, although he is going to be immediately rushed down by these two red forces that are across the way from him, which I don't think he was expecting, to be honest. But nonetheless, he will have to adapt and improvise, as a few of us are going to have to do in this battle based on the armies that we've brought. He's got some Nandor Glade Riders here, which are very, very fragile. They don't have a lot of armour, they don't have shields, so arrows can kill them off very, very quickly. However, they have an absolutely lethal charge bonus. They have the joint highest charge in the game, I think, of 20. Maybe a couple of units which go a little bit higher than that, but still, they have a charge which is on par with knights, so it means that they are extremely dangerous if you allow them to get a good charge off. But of course, the downside to that is they are very fragile as well, and relatively easy to zone out, and considering things are going to get quite hectic down here, they're going to be one of the first things, I imagine, to be focused down. He's got a full front line of Elvelyn infantry, which is good because he's going to need to immediately engage the two forces which are across from him and hold out until reinforcements arrive. So a good amount there of the solid Elvelyn infantry, and they're also going to be backed up by the more elite Elven units. The Morroquendi pikes are here to help shore up the lines. That should also help him hold out for longer, as well as the mighty Morroquendi Glade Masters. So that's going to be another unit which will really help on the front line here. But even so, the odds are still going to be stacked against him until reinforcements arrive. But he also has the Morroquendi Glade Lords, of course, the Dorwinian Knights, very, very strong. Elven Knights in general will tend to be very, very powerful. Obviously, the Horse Lords of Ulmo from Linden, the Gwaith Rokdor from Imladris, and of course the Glade Lords are now from Dorwinian. So we'll see how well they can be used, but of course he does need to... he can't just afford to charge them in, because there are a lot of dangerous units around here, which will very quickly deal with him, including the Ents, which you can see over there. Moving on to Sin's army, who Sin is the closest one to him, but he still has a little way to march. He has his forces over here, because I think we were expecting the majority of the fight to happen in sort of the mouth of the valley, as it were, over here on the road, rather than the red team deploying over the hill, so we're going to have to rapidly reposition ourselves. He's got some Elvelyn marksmen here, which are of course a very good archer unit to use for skirmishing with the enemy. Good over a long atrocious engagement, although considering how fast the battle's going to get underway here, their more defensive nature will probably not be as useful as it normally is, but still, their ranged attacks are pretty decent, honestly. With a missile attack of 6, they are definitely on the same sort of level as archers of something like the Bardian Marksman or the Balaketh Marksman from Umbar. Just in behind them, some more Elvelyn infantry, of course, very heavily armoured human infantry. He has also brought some Elvelyn Vine Guards. We can see over here the Spear variant, which of course, lower attack, worse against infantry. But they do have the shield wall and that bonus against cavalry. Sin has also brought the Morroquendi Glade Lords. I think 9 times out of 10 you'll see Dorwinian bring the Glade Lords on a field battle because they're so strong. Back up here we have the Morroquendi Bows, of course, with their poison arrows up here. And a few hidden units are going to be scattered around as well, including back here, which I think this is where his other cavalry force is. Just keeping them out of harm's way for the time being, given their fragile nature. Now we shall move on to my army, and I'm going to be playing as Dol Amroth. Most of my money was actually spent on my cavalry force, to be honest with you, so here we have a bit of a skeleton crew with regards to my frontal infantry force and archers. I've only got a couple of units of archers on foot, which is going to be the Dor and Ernil archers, without the armour upgrade as well, because I had gone right to 0 florins. But even so, the Dor and Ernil archers are pretty much your standard human line archer. They're certainly not as strong as the Alvelin marksmen that they're going to be fighting alongside in this battle. But they're also significantly cheaper, and really they're just there to engage in those long engagements, and you don't mind overly if you start to lose unit models from them. I had just enough money as well to secure myself another unit of Dor and Ernil swordsmen here, which militia swordsmen are never going to kill off tons of units. They'll be able to defeat sort of very lowly orc infantry in melee, but for the most part what you can expect from militia swordsmen rather than spears is the fact that they will put up more of a fight in melee against other units, especially if you back them up. They won't be half bad. Obviously they're very cheap as well at 400 florins, but they certainly aren't going to win any prizes in terms of overall quality. Behind them, a couple of units of Ethelon men-at-arms with the armour upgrade as well, so this makes them pretty resilient against arrow fire, which is a very good thing considering what I'm going to be facing off against today. Shields, armour, decent of course, but again, like with most human men-at-arms units, they don't have a huge amount of attack, so they're very much focused around just keeping themselves alive in melee and sort of being that centre to your line. On both flanks, I have 2 units of Untitled Champions, which are units of heavy swordsmen for Dol Amroth, one of the new units that they've got in patch 0.97. A very good addition to them as well, because heavy swordsmen, of course, are very good in a prolonged melee fight because they have a very high defensive skill, very high base damage as well. They may not have the AP that heavy axemen and hammers have, but ultimately they do tend to do better in these sorts of engagements where you're expecting the engagement to last a little bit longer, and I couldn't really afford to bring armour-piercing troops like the Black Swan Renegades here, because while they do have shields, I wanted a little bit more quality in melee, a little bit more longevity, and also considering that Mirkwood is the faction that I was facing off against opposite me, this sort of unit is going to be very, very useful if I can get into melee with them. A couple of units of Belfalas Marines. Javelins are very important in patch 0.97 I've noticed, and I might have a few things to say about that in the results screen actually. Not that the javelins were overly impactful on this particular battle, but even so, the Belfalas Marines, and also there are Selduin River Patrol for both Dorwinian armies, I believe, but they can hide anywhere of course. And then I've got a couple of units of Dor and Ernil pikemen, which of course, basic pikes, very run-of-the-mill. On the front line they can certainly mean that they can hold a lot of better units than themselves at bay. Very few pikes will do damage quickly, really only the highest tier of Elven, Dwarven, and there are a few human pikes that can do it as well. But basic pikes like this are just there to really be that centre to your line and make sure that you don't get overrun, which is important considering my smaller amount of infantry, because most of my army is bound up in my cavalry. A lot of my money went into this, which turned out to be a poor choice actually, but nonetheless, again, I have to adapt and sort of overcome. I have my Haven Knights, which are my General's Bodyguard, obviously very, very powerful melee knights indeed. Dol Amroth do have access to the Arathirim now, which are a Lance Knight variant, but they have fewer men in the unit, they are cheaper, but ultimately considering I was up against Mirkwood and the possibility of going up against the very powerful Mirkwood Spear Cavalry was here, I decided to dip heavily into my melee cavalry, which is what was the poor choice in the end, but we'll see that when we look at the Mirkwood army. Perithal Horse Guard, for the same reason, a very good unit of melee cavalry, whereas most factions will have to make do with stuff like mercenary cavalry. Dol Amroth have this unit, which is more expensive, but it's infinitely better. It's a very, very strong unit to have on horseback, and 9 times out of 10 will secure you the cavalry advantage as Dol Amroth if you can use them well. I have a couple of units of Knights of the Silver Swan, my Lancers, so this is the upper end of Dol Amroth's Lancers, only the Arathirim are stronger than them. Heavily armoured, shielded, all of the things that you want from your higher end Lancers. Fairly expensive, but not as expensive as they were in the last patch. In the last patch they were grossly overpriced. That is not the case anymore, I'm glad to say. And then finally a unit of Swan Knights, so another unit of melee cavalry, albeit even higher tier than the Perithal Horse Guard, but also unshielded, so a very substantial cavalry force here indeed. And then finally we have Mordor, played by Agalar Galudithon. As far as the theme for this battle, I suppose you could say it's north versus south in a way. It'd be a bit of a squiggly line considering Dorwinian's geographical position, but that's the closest thing I can have, because obviously it's not lore friendly, this one, but still, north versus south it will be. Agalar here is going to be playing as Mordor, which Mordor are honestly probably my least favourite orc faction, but that's not really anything against Mordor, it's just that the other three tend to have a few more unique aspects to them, so it's really just the fact that Mordor, they seem to have sort of fallen into the same trap that Lothlorien did in the last patch, where they don't really have anything, there's nothing wrong with them, but they don't have anything super unique to them, and I think that's just the fact they don't really have anything new. whereas the other 3, they've at least been changed enough that they feel significantly different, whereas Mordor, they feel mostly the same, just in 0.97's different mechanics. Moran Guard, though, are one unit which benefits from 0.97's mechanics with their spears. Obviously, spears are much better against cavalry now. Just in behind them, we have the new unit mod for the Sauron's Will, a little bit more savage with their bloodied and serrated axes. Obviously, still very much mechanically the same, it's just a cosmetic change that they've undergone. Some Orc Maulers as well, so some cheap shock infantry. They're opposite the Dwarves, so it's not too surprising that they've dipped more heavily into their AP. Orc Fodder, of course, are free for the first unit, so you may as well bring them. We have the Bulldogs of Durthang, which are, of course, previously the Minas Morgul Bodyguard. Very nice multiple HP line infantry unit there for the General. More Moran Guard, interesting pick as well. More Orc Fodder, so he's gone for some cheap units here in the centre. Orc Javelins, I think, are a must-bring as Mordor, because they're so cheap, and potentially, again, nice damage that Javelins can dish out, especially against the Dwarves. So, very good choice there. Temple Inquisitors and Melkor's chosen 2 very powerful mounted units, and Olag High, so obviously Mordor's strength is really bound up in their elites, so we'll see how Agalar can use these units over here. And then out on the flank, I think it's mostly the same sort of thing. Yeah, Maulers, Sauron's Will, and Moran Guard. Interesting army, this. I don't see any Temple Guard, which is interesting. They're usually a pretty safe bet against the Dwarves. Speaking of which, let's have a look at the Dwarves over here. We have Inarius, who's going to be playing as Erebor. Erebor are pretty good, I have to say, in 0.97. I do like Erebor. The one problem they do have is that they do not have as strong a morale as their brethren from Khazad-dûm, which is something you can use against them. But ultimately, it's not to the same level as something like Cardlin is, where as long as you're organised as Erebor, it's not something you're really going to notice, I don't think. But it is worth saying. But even so, their infantry is very, very strong. You have the Ironfoot Warriors and Ironfoot Pikes here on the front line, a very solid front line. Nothing overly special, but it should still be more than enough to deal with any orcs that come their way. We also have some spears out on the flank, of course, the natural habitat of spears such as themselves. Double layering, actually, the Ironfoot spears. He's also got some Erebor Legionaries, which are, of course, very, very nice line infantry indeed, far stronger than the Ironfoot Warriors. Ironfoot Wargoats and Ironfoot Chariots. Now, the Ironfoot Chariots, of course, we all know what chariots are like, and the Erebor Chariots are really no different from the other ones, only they have crossbows on the back, and everyone knows how powerful crossbows can be. And here in the centre, we have some Obsidian Guard, which will be able to mulch their way through most Orc infantry all day long. And then over here, we also have some Highborns of Erebor. One thing Erebor can certainly do is field a lot of elite infantry unit. It costs them to field like tons of it, of course. But even so, as we've already seen, Erebor have got a lot of units which are multiple HP. You can't field all of them in a field battle where funds are even, of course, but still. And then some Axe Guard of Erebor here on this flank. Then, up on this bit of ground, we have one of the most horrifying sights I've ever seen. We have Frodo playing as Mirkwood. And as you can see, you can't see an awful lot of his army, but you can see from the double layers of stakes that he has got, I think, pretty much an all-missile army. I don't think he's got a single unit that does not have some form of ranged attack. So he has got Woodland Realm Patrol, he has got Hiri Peng here behind the stakes, he has got the Elven King, the Elders of the Elven King, the Wardens of Amon Lanka in here somewhere. Both units of Elder Council, of course, being Javelins. Ordinarily, this would not be a great idea. Just bringing nothing but ranged units would be pretty bad, especially against a faction with a lot of cavalry, because you can find gaps. However, the problem is, when you have this defensible position over here, it becomes less great for me, because obviously there's a lot of stakes, you can't really get through them, and also just the fact that Mirkwood's archers are good enough to the point where if you do send your cavalry on a frontal charge, it is rather like that scene in The Last Samurai, where the Gatling gun is firing upon them as they advance, and they just get cut to pieces. That is, if all my cavalry charged, that would not be the case, because they couldn't target down all of them, but if all my cavalry charged, I would just meet my end at the tips of these stakes over here. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, this map here for this army. I would ordinarily not recommend you do this. Even as Mirkwood, it is unlikely to work out, because you're going to have to dip into the red limit several times. It's not the most efficient way of doing things, and of course, if you are going up against someone who is going to be aggressive against you, it's going to work out poorly for you. And the only reason that Mirkwood can get away with this even here is the fact that my infantry is, I haven't got a lot of infantry, and the Elven archers are good enough in melee that they will be able to defeat sort of very basic units that the likes of which Dol Amroth have brought here. The Perithil champions will do alright, but there's only 2 units of them. So yeah, ordinarily don't do this, but in this case, Frodo has unknowingly played a bit of a blinder here, because I can't really deal with this with my army. If I was playing as someone like Angmar, or maybe, you know, one of the Dwarven factions where I had a lot of heavy infantry and I could just charge forward, this would be terrible for Unfrodo, but based on the fact I've got a very cavalry-centric army and I don't have a great deal of numbers to my name, it's not going to be great for me. So interesting to see how that will work out. And then finally, we have these two armies over here. We have Death Eater playing as Imladris. Of course, his army is going to be all deployed over here and is going to try and charge down and rush Eclipse 2500 very quickly. Archers of Rivendell, Gwythy Rockdor, Eldarenway Lancers. He's got some Riders of the Bruin in there as well. Upgraded Imladris Guardians, a lot of Eldarenway, Swordmasters and Spearmen. It's a little bit difficult to sort of make out what's in this blob. They have some pikes in there as well, some sentries. But Imladris, and we have over here the Hobbits. So we have the Shire, played by the Steward of Dale. I don't know if actually he's, you know, most of the Shire's force can hide. So I'm sure that we'll see them pop into existence very soon. So Battling Brandybucks, Sheriffs of the Farthings, Ents, and that's pretty much all I can see actually. But yeah, any hidden units will obviously pop into existence very quickly. It's a very potent combination actually, because the Shire, most people have realised at this point that on a field battle like this, rushing, the Hobbits are really, really vicious. And alongside Imladris, who can sort of offset the Hobbits' lack of quality and defensive skill, this is almost like the perfect combination here, especially seeing as we weren't expecting them to deploy here. Eclipse is going to be in a good deal of trouble if we can't reinforce them quickly. Speaking of which, let's get underway. So I'm sure that we'll see the Hobbits all just pop into existence now, with a lot of their units being able to hide. Much like Mirkwood, you can see here immediately Imladris are going to be charging down the hill, and Imladris' cavalry is going to be coming into position here. The Morroquendi Stalkers reveal themselves, the Dorwinian Horse Archers, but of course they are not great under arrow fire either, and immediately the Elves are going to be able to do a decent amount of damage there. A real clash of the Titans early on here between the Gwythy Rockdor and the Morroquendi Glade Lords. I'm honestly not sure who would win that fight when they both charge into each other like this. This isn't going to be a perfect representation of that fight, of course, because, you know, there's going to be other things affecting it. And you can see immediately over here, the Nandor Glade Guard have been revealed. A very fragile unit of shock infantry, once again, very high damage but very low armour, and they're immediately going to be pelted by the Sheriffs of the Farthings, throwing their projectiles at them. And then immediately over here you can see that Imladris have maybe gotten a little bit further ahead of, we'll go into half speed here while this rush happens. That Imladris were closer to Eclipse 2500, so his army is going to get there first, but as soon as the Hobbit folk get into the flank of Dorwinion, they're going to be able to start working up the line. So Sin is going to come over here, and seeing that this was happening as well, and seeing Mirkwood's horrendous army considering my composition, I also decided to shift my Belfast Marines over here, because there's no way that I'm going to be moving towards Mirkwood. I'll get cut to pieces if I do that. My cavalry is also going to go to help Mordor. I'm going to do everything in my power to avoid Mirkwood for as long as I possibly can. But over here is where all the action is happening at the moment. The Morroquendi Stalkers have already been cut to pieces by archers, and they're now going to get speared by the Gwythy Rockdor. Eclipse is trying to get over to Sin's defensive position that he has set up in the valley on the road. But it's going to be difficult. I mean, a fighting retreat like this is always going to be pretty brutal for you, especially if you're dealing with an Imladris push, because all of their very high quality infantry. Dorwinian's infantry is usually quite capable of holding its own against most stuff, at least in the defensive department. But here, when they're being sort of clattered into by Ents, by all of this Imladris infantry as well, and when the Hobbit infantry arrives, you know, it may not be the best in terms of keeping itself alive, but the armor piercing will be very useful. The perfect augment, really, to the Imladris push as it happens. The Elven pikes coming down as well. So a very, very nice rush here, albeit facilitated by a bit of a dodgy deployment zone. The Elvelyn infantry is here. The Morroquendi pikes a little bit further away from the front line. They're going to be needed on the front line, although even then I don't think the Morroquendi pikes will be able to stop this advance. The Imladris pikemen are stronger pound for pound. It's going to be very difficult indeed. Eldarenway Swordmasters getting in here to the Elvelyn infantry. Again, this is a pretty good example of what's happening all along the line, really. The Elvelyn infantry are by no means a bad unit, but they're going up against some of the very best Elven infantry that there is, so it's going to be very difficult for them. But Sin is coming in with a lot of his Elvelyn units. The Gwythy Rockdor may be getting a bit too big for their boots there, charging right into a clump of Elvelyn infantry, but the Vine Guard are here. The Glade Riders from Eclipse 2500 also coming over here. My Belfast Marines also coming in, so they're going to need to run away, otherwise the Javelins are going to be able to do a lot of damage to them. From up on the hill, the Morroquendi bows do have a shot on some of these units, so they're going to be able to use their poison arrows to good effect there. Meanwhile, over here you can see that Aguilar is going to be moving forward, trying to put some pressure on the Erebor line, and you can see that my cavalry is going to be moving with him around the flank. Having said that, the Dwarves While it is preferable to try and attack the dwarves with my cavalry here, rather than Mirkwood, just because of all the stakes that are around them, I could go right around the back, but even then there's javelins there, so in a narrow engagement against the spear-javelin hybrids, it would not go well for me at all. But the dwarves have got a lot of pikes, halberds and spears themselves, as well as their war goats, which 1-to-1 are going to be a bit of a problem as well. We can beat them, of course, quite easily, especially with the Mordor cavalry in tow. But it's still not going to be the best engagement. We can do as much damage as we can to the dwarves with their cavalry, and then hope that the elven archers burn themselves out. You can see the elves are just sort of skirmishing with me, but really, they're only hitting my Dor and Ernil archers and some of my Dor and Ernil swordsmen, so I don't really care too much about that, to be honest with you. I'd rather they burn some of their ammunition on them, because I can't move in, so that's as good as I can hope for. Over here we have the Elvelyn Vanguard pushing back the riders of the Bruinen. The Gwaithri Rockdor are also over here as well. The Eldarenway Swordmasters now finding themselves a little bit surrounded by all this Elvelyn infantry. The Belfast Marines getting into position, but as we go around the battlefield, you can see that Eclipse 2500's line starting to look a little bit thin in places. It's never good when you see that, that thick Imladris push coming in, with the Hobbit folk also backing them up. The Hobbitry in arms. They may only be very basic spears, but that AP is definitely going to help. The Elvelyn infantry trying to keep the line intact, but the problem they have, of course, Bjorning is coming in. I can actually see over here that the most of the Hobbit army was actually way around here, so they didn't deploy all of their army, to be fair. Over here there is another little pathway through the into the road over here that they can take, and the rest of the Hobbits are going to be pushing up. But just the fact that it is effectively 1.5 armies against 1 army for the most part, and obviously Sin's getting here now. The Belfast Marines are also going to move up, and I'm going to try and get my javelins into a position where I can shoot into Imladris, because honestly, if we can take away a lot of Imladris' manpower, this battle does become a little bit less scary. But the problem is, you've got units like Ents over here squashing Elvelyn infantry. You've got Bjornings charging into these units over here, bandits using their javelins. There's really very little resistance left over here for Eclipse. There are a few units still sticking out, but I mean, when you're trying to micro a sort of cascading failure like this, it's very difficult for Eclipse in this sort of situation. Obviously, he was the one that got the brunt of the attentions earlier on of the enemy. You can see here the Belfast Marines getting into position as well. Gwaithri Rockdor much more depleted at this point. So Imladris certainly haven't been able to advance onto this position for nothing, but it's definitely been a very worthwhile push forward. Here come the Elvelyn Vanguard. The Gwaithri Rockdor actually charging into them. Not the best charge either. They didn't connect with many unit models, so those spears may very well start to reap a bit of a toll on them. You can see over here that also the Eldarenway Swordmasters starting to get a little bit overwhelmed. Sin has also brought over some skirmishes over here as well. Elvelyn Marksmen. Belfast Marines trying to get into a position for a better shot. Belfast Marines over here going to be throwing their javelins right into the heart of that elven blob. I was trying to target the pikes more than anything, but anything they hit at this point will be worthwhile because they will get kills, and it's only a matter of time before Eclipse's army buckles under the pressure, so we need to try and get as much damage done here on the road as we can before we think about trying to pull back. You can see over here the assault is beginning. The Mordor orcs are starting to collide with the Dwarven infantry. And unfortunately, because of the Mirkwood army, a lot of my melee cavalry is not really going to be the best. I can still use them as makeshift shock cavalry, of course, just because of the mass of cavalry. But overall, I would have been much better off bringing like the Arathirium of Dol Amroth, even the lower tier Lancers. My Knights of the Silver Swan will honestly be my best bet in terms of cavalry for doing damage. So you can see over here that I'm going to try and use my Knights of the Silver Swan to charge into the back of the Ironfoot Spears. It's still not ideal. But with the armor-piercing Mordor infantry from the front and with a charge from the rear, but unfortunately the lances don't go down, and there's not really a lot of room here to get a nice charge off, which is again unfortunate for me. But hopefully we can cause some morale shocks for Erebor. As I said, that is something you can do. It's not as easy as it would be for like against an Orc faction or against a Cardlin, but it is something you can still do. If they don't have any inspiration units nearby, Erebor can be a little bit vulnerable to that sort of thing. The chariots, however, are running through the javelins, which is not great. The javelins are one of Mordor's better tools in this sort of situation. The Olag Kai are moving in as well. You can see their Knights of the Silver Swan really crushing into the Ironfoot Spears, but the chariots are also doing their thing. Axguard of Erebor are moving in, and unfortunately the already wavering fodder after being run over by the chariots, yeah, this is definitely going to be the end of them. There's absolutely no way that they survive that. This unit of Ironfoot Spears, however, is completely surrounded by Orc Maulers, so that's very, very good. Obviously surrounded, meaning their melee defense is going to be crippled. and also the armor piercing coming in as well, so their plate armor will not be enough to save them. Trying to sort of cycle out my Knights of the Silver Swan, and you know, in this sort of situation where the defense is relatively tightly packed and there's no like really easy targets to go after, I'm going to be taking losses with my cavalry all the time, which is going to be unfortunate, but still, it can't be helped. You can see here the Ents have gotten into my Belfast Marines, so they've been shut down. They got a few good volleys off, but probably not enough to justify them bringing them over here, to be honest with you. But still, the attempt to save Private Eclipse was not really successful. But still, Sin has sent over some more Elvelen infantry. He's pushing forward to try and stop Imladris from just carving through his Elvelen units as well. There goes Eclipse's general. Run down by the Hobbits and Imladris put together. The Elvelen marksman. This unit of Belfast Marines still firing away. And to be fair, with all of these archers, especially the Morroquendi bows up on the hill over there, occasionally providing some overwatch, the javelins and the Elvelen marksmen, Imladris, their army is pretty damaged at this point. They have paid the price for essentially killing off Eclipse, and eventually they will also get the better of Sin's Elvelen units as well, simply because they don't have the attack to really go toe-to-toe with Imladris without the support of the Morroquendi. So it is going to be mostly the Hobbits which will secure the road. Not that that's any better, because of course the Hobbits have got a ton of manpower and a ton of armor piercing, which is going to be bad. But at the very least, there's still hope for us in this fight as long as we can do something on the other side. Morroquendi Stalker's coming over here as well, and unfortunately again now with Sin sort of running out of manpower to cover our skirmishes with, my javelins are about to get absolutely pasted by the Elven Lancers. The Morroquendi Stalkers are going to crest the hill. Both of Sin's units of them, as well as his Morroquendi Glade Lord, so he's going to try and do some charging with his knights, some damage as well with his archers. But it's definitely a bit of a sticky situation here, especially with the Bjornings now coming forward. They're going to pound the Elvelen marksmen into the dirt as well. I was thinking about sending over some Perithil champions, but I thought better of it in the end. You can see that I have shifted further back, because as the situation unfolds, it's becoming clear that we're going to need to try and take a more defensive position. Meanwhile, over here you can see that the cavalry is in and amongst the Dwarven units, and to be fair, we have managed to push the Dwarves back. Melkor's Chosen coming in here, so that a lot of the Mordor infantry in this battle particularly was armor piercing, which is very, very good against the Dwarves. And obviously again with the additional support of this cavalry as well, sending my Perithil Horse Guard in. I was actually trying to go after the Ironfoot War Goats, but unfortunately the jaws were shut. But at least they will be here sort of lending a bit of support to the Olag High, because the Olag High are a little bit isolated in this situation. If the Obsidian Guard get in, it could get pretty nasty. Knights the Silver Swan over here. And at this point you can see the Morannon Guard are charging in, trying to stop some of the Elven units from firing. As really Merc would have just been shooting this whole time into Mordor's infantry, my cavalry, and of course they've still been skirmishing with my Dor and Ernil units, but again, honestly, my Dor and Ernil units, when I saw the Mirkwood army, they were always going to be sacrificial lambs. So they're just going to be there trying to absorb a lot of the Mirkwood ammunition, because if Mirkwood run out of ammunition, their archers are still very good in melee, of course, but they become substantially less scary. Knights the Silver Swan peeling off, the Melkor's Chosen still coming over here, so a lot of the Dwarven infantry is sort of fighting down here in the basin. They should still be able to fight their way out of this, to be honest with you, with their elites, and considering the fact that you know, I do have some cavalry in support. I've got my Haven Knights back there, my Swan Knights as well, which I'm going to move over to this flank in just a second, but it's still going to be difficult for us to do much here. But I can see a bit of an opportunity here to charge into the Greenwood Rangers, and I need to take it, because otherwise Mordor are going to be in horrendous difficulties if they have to take Elven Ranger fire for a prolonged period of time. So I'm going to send my Knights to Silver Swan in, but you can see here that this is the problem. I mean, Knights to Silver Swan are heavily armoured and shielded cavalry, but like 5 units of Elven Archers just fired a volley into them, and that's going to be enough. Well, 4 units I think actually is more accurate, and that's going to be enough to kill off, you know, heavily armoured cavalry. I do manage to charge into the Greenwood Rangers to stop them from firing, but of course the problem is I've shut down 1 unit of archers, but there are like 3 other units of archers nearby, which are going to be able to continue to fire into the Knights of the Silver Swan. Erebor Legionary is charged by Perithil Horse Guard. Down here you can see that Ironfoot Warriors were sticking out, so I charged them with Knights of the Silver Swan, but there are halberds nearby, so I'm going to need to be very careful. More Horse Guard are over here. But let's go and see what's happening over on this side of things. You can see that Sin's Elvelen are starting to break, which is of course bad news for us. My Belfast Marines have been utterly vanquished by the Imladris cavalry. Sin's cavalry as well, his Morroquendi Stalkers have been dealt with fairly roundly by the enemy. This unit of Morroquendi Stalkers is still over here, getting into the Banderbrass Archers and the Tookish Hunters, I believe, indeed. So they'll be able to get a decent amount of kills here on these Hobbit Archers. They're not the best in melee, of course, they don't have the highest defensive values. Riders of the Bruinen are still firing. Sin's Morroquendi Glade Lords are over here. Only 10 of them remaining. There are Javelins nearby. There are Rock Throwers nearby. There are Horse Archers nearby. They're really caught in the spider's web here. Not great for them. And also the Elvelyn Marksmen are going to have to be left behind as a bit of a rear guard so that we can try and form up a defensive position on that hill, because at this point things are heavily going against the blue team, it's fair to say. We have lost fairly substantially over on this side. Imladris have taken a good deal of losses themselves, but the Hobbits are still in pretty good order. And a lot of Sin's army has died, pretty much all of Eclipse's army has died. And I don't have a lot of infantry, honestly, to hold the line over here, so we're going to need to retreat up to the up onto this hill so that we can try and make the engagement a bit narrower, because that will, of course, mean that my pikes can do their thing. If we get into a sort of grindy infantry fight as well, that's not going to suit the Hobbits too much if they have to deal with pikemen. And also the Parathor champions cause fear, which hopefully we'll be able to deal with the squishier Hobbits a little bit better. The Knights of the Silver Swan, another unit of Knights of the Silver Swan, I should say, the other unit that I had, are going to try and charge into the Rangers as well. Charging uphill into a unit in loose formation. Elves as well, which, you know, Elven defensive values. I don't know if the Rangers' defensive value is good enough to sort of dodge a charge, but there's nothing more annoying to see Elves dodge a cavalry charge. Like, what on earth is that all about? That's something baked into the medieval mechanics, though, so I mean, you know, you either take away the Elves' melee defense to the point where they aren't really Elves anymore, or you just have to try and deal with it. But still, Knights of the Silver Swan charging into the Greenwood Rangers, getting a few kills. At this point I'm just trying to stop the Rangers from firing, but unfortunately I think there's a second unit of Greenwood Rangers that the Elves have brought because of their all-skirmish nature in this fight. You can see here the Temple Inquisitors, unshielded, much like my Swan Knights, and they're going to be running around as well. Haven Knights are over there, they've already taken losses as well, as a result of being shot up. There are my Swan Knights. The Dwarves are still very much alive. But to be fair, Mordor has done a bit of a number on the Dwarves down here. While my cavalry has been throwing itself under the bus, trying to stop the Elven archers from doing damage, the Mordor-focused, they're the Nazgul even, with the Baldogs, the AP-focused Mordor army is doing pretty well against the Dwarves of Erebor, which is good. The Olag High have also not taken a great deal of losses. Archers aren't the best against Olag High. There's the Orc Fodder and the Morannon Guard. Here come the Parathor Horse Guard, which didn't actually take as many losses on the approach as the Knights of the Silver Swan did. And they're going to try and do some damage there on the charge of the Greenwood Rangers again, but again it's more just to stop them from firing for a little while, because if those Rangers are allowed to fire for any length of time, Mordor's infantry will be cut to bits, which we really don't want. Some Ironfoot Warriors sticking out here, and my Swan Knights are going to charge in. Again, as melee cavalry they don't have the best charge, especially in comparison to something like Knights of the Silver Swan. But their mass should still do a number on them, and also just the fact that they aren't spears or halberds means that I need to take the opportunity to charge into what targets I can. So very, very nice. And the Olag High also moving in to charge into these halberds. Very nice charge there from the Swan Knights. And you know, honestly, Erebor at this point don't have much left. They do have their crossbows up on the hill, up on this sort of clump, this skirmish position of doom. Obviously, you know, the odds are very much against us to try and deal with that, but still. Riders of the Bruinen coming over here. Parathor champions, I think they got charged, but again, very much like the Elves, their melee defense means they can mitigate a frontal charge somewhat, and you can see that some of the Imladris cavalry, those are Elder Enway Lancers even, that not only got shot by poison arrows, but also had to deal with the Parathor champions in melee. So you can see here that now, at this point, the time has come to try and retreat up onto the hill. My Dora and Ernil are also going to get up here. Dora and Ernil archers are still alive, even though very depleted. They have pretty much all their ammo, because they haven't actually been able to use it, because the elves, of course, outrange basic human archers like this. So even though they're very depleted, they still have all their ammo, so they will still be useful for holding this hilltop position as all my infantry starts to retreat. I've got my Parathor champions over here to sort of, you know, I can see the answer on the way, so something has to be left behind. I'd rather it not be Parathor champions, but unfortunately that's the way the battle has fallen so far. I think it's about time we moved up to 1 speed, actually. As the Haven Knights charge into the Hiri Peng. And that's a very nice charge, actually. Again, the Haven Knights may be melee cavalry. There comes some javelins, though. The Haven Knights are one of the tankiest units of cavalry in the game. But even so, like javelins, especially when you show them their back, it's going to be very bad for them. Perithal Horse Guard are going to charge in. Again, their spears in melee, the Elder Council, so I don't expect to actually win this fight at all. I just want to stop the Elder Council from firing. There's a very costly charge from the Haven Knights, but again, there's not really much else I can do with them here. Swan Knights are over here, taking losses. You can see here that the Elders of the Elven King are here, the Ironfoot crossbows. It's always a really... Your heart sinks when you see crossbows and elven archers up on a ridge like that. It's been a constant uphill fight for us as the blue team at this point in the battle. But we've done a good job against the dwarves. You know, considering the rough hand we were dealt, we've managed to really wipe the dwarves away down here on the lower ground. Unfortunately, with all the elven archers, and again, I feel as though this is the downside of having a full archer army like this. Mirkwood were able to provide really no support in melee for Erebor, which meant that my cavalry and Mordor's infantry was able to sort of rush over and around the Erebor infantry and do a good job against them. So at this point, Erebor really only have their crossbows left alive. There goes my general, of course, unsurprisingly, still trying to stop the elven archers, because at this point Mordor are going to, I think, retreat, because they're not daft. They're not going to charge into this position uphill against all those Mirkwood archers. They're going to save as much as they can, which Mordor are very depleted as well at this point, it must be said. So they're just going to hold back. They're going to pull back their army and see what transpires over on this side of things. See the Riders of the Bruinen trying to get into the Seldwyn River Patrol over here as we form up our defensive position on the hilltop. Sin has still got all of his javelins, which is a big boon for us, because it means that we're going to be able to pelt the enemy as they try and move into position. Imladris and the Hobbits. It's very unlikely that Mirkwood are going to be able to provide much support over here. Doran Ernil Swordsman, which actually returned from routing, I believe. But this, the ultimate bait, the militia, now the Nandor Glade Riders, Sin's extremely powerful cavalry is going to move in. The Gwythi Rockdor here also. Doran Ernil Swordsmen are going to provide what support they can on foot. And they were really one of my hidden gems in this fight, the Doran Ernil Swordsmen, because they routed and returned from routing, I think, 4 times by the end of this fight. They ended up being more resolute overall than my regular infantry, actually, but we'll talk about that later. Seldwyn River Patrol retreating up the hill. The Imladris forces are moving in, but in drips and drabs, which is not really going to help them. There goes the Imladris general, meeting their end at the hands of a Morroquendi glaive. The Riders of the Bruinen trying to charge in. They're going to try and push through, but I don't really know what they hope to accomplish here. They're not really going to get very many kills unless they get a charge off, and they just sort of walked into melee there. And as if that wasn't enough, my pikes are now going to shift into position, so the time for cavalry is most certainly over. Sin's cavalry down here, though, is going to be able to run roughshod in the backlines at this point. Hobbitry and arms getting routed. And this is where the Glade Riders really come into their own, because off the charge they are absolutely lethal. Here on the front line you can see that the Ents are going to try and get in here. Sin's javelins in support. My archers are also going to be firing at what targets they can. Perithal champions are going to try and add their fear effect to this front line, because of course the men-at-arms and the pikemen just going to hold things in position for the javelins and the archers and the cavalry to do things. So really I'm very much the anvil and Sin is the hammer. He is going to be moving, and he's also got his Glade Masters over here, so this would be a horrifying sight for the Hobbits to see. I've got my Doran Ernil Swordsmen over here, but of course they're really just making up the numbers. They're going to get into the bandits and prevent them from firing a single volley with their jabbies, which is good. The bandits are not great in melee either, so to be honest with you, my Doran Ernil Swordsmen probably win that fight, considering the numbers are very much in our favour. Riders of the Bruinen are over here. Over here you can see that Mordor are going to continue to run from Mirkwood, which is absolutely the right thing. Not playing into this very annoying Mirkwood composition's hands. Hobbitry and arms are also moving forward here. You can see here the Riders of the Bruinen are trying to... They actually charged into my Perithal champions, which were already depleted, to be honest with you. But yeah, Doran Ernil Swordsman also shaken at this point, for the Morroquendi Glade Mass. They're going to get into the Proudfoot Protectors and rip them to pieces. They are pikes in melee as well, which is another sort of very awkward and annoying unit that the Hobbits have at their disposal. Sin is going to have to be careful of these stakes as he manoeuvres his cavalry around, but he's absolutely ripping the Hobbit skirmishers to pieces. And as if that wasn't enough, the Hobbit front line and the Imladris front line was too depleted in the end to actually do much. The Morroquendi bows pulling out their spears in melee, or glaives I suppose is a little bit more appropriate. The Perithal champions adding again their fear to the front line is causing a lot of the Hobbit infantry to waver. And also with those pikes on the front lines, the Hobbits are not really going to be able to lay down any of their AP against our infantry. There goes Samwise, cleaved in twain by a glaive. Morroquendi bows, the Selduin River Patrol are advancing down here as well. So this is exactly what we needed to get back into this fight. A really comprehensive victory, which came courtesy really of Sin's cavalry more than anything else. Those Glade Riders. This really is the Glade Riders at their very, very best, because they are very fragile. But if you use them like that, they can do damage so quickly. And the Hobbits and what was left of Imladris, completely broken. And at this point, what's left of myself and Sin's army is going to have to try and catch Mirkwood between us, because Mirkwood at this point, they pretty much haven't lost any of their manpower, Mirkwood, because, you know, it's very difficult to engage them. They've taken a few charges on their archers, but for the most part, Mirkwood's army is at least 85 to 90% healthy, I'd say. They have the support of some Erebor units, but at this point, it's going to be 3 very depleted armies trying to take on 1 almost fully healthy army, in addition to some crossbowmen. And this is where Mirkwood's strength in melee with their archers is going to come into play. Going to have to come into play if they hope to win this, because suddenly this match is looking far more even than it was just 5 minutes ago. As we move forward, Selduin River Patrol, we're really scouring them from the field. Of course, the problem that I have at this point is to try and sort of make a sort of united front with Sin. All of his units that are remaining pretty much are Morroquendi. He's got Selduin River Patrol, but they're Lightfoot human units as well, so they're very fast. Whereas my units are sort of heavily armoured infantry, so they're actually slower, so I'm going to have to sort of go into a full sprint to try and keep up with Sin here, because we definitely want to keep our strength together, because if we get strung out here, Mirkwood are going to be able to pick us apart individually. Speaking of which, Mordor are moving in maybe a little bit prematurely. This will, however, focus most of Mirkwood and Erebor's skirmishers onto them, rather than myself and Dorwinion. The Olakai are back here, and they're always going to be a factor, of course. They're still pretty healthy. I mean, 7. Those Olakai have not been focused down. Well, the Orc Maulers, I think they're trying to kill the Nazgul with the crossbows, which is very understandable, but the Orc Maulers are going to be able to get into melee. They probably won't last too long, to be honest with you. Mordor's army is likely to break, even with the Nazgul in close proximity. The Wardens of Amon Lank are going to come forward. The Nandor Glade Riders are going to charge in. Of course, that is where the Nandor Glade Riders are absolutely not at their best. Charging right into a unit of Rangers. The Rangers, of course, able to use their body piercing to full effect. They did manage to get in there. There's 1 Temple Inquisitor left as well. Stopping them from firing is the key here, because we need to get all of these melee units in. You can see that my units are lagging behind a bit, because they're substantially slower than the Elven Morroquendi. And of course now, Mirkwood are going to have to try and turn around and shoot us on the approach, because they can probably deal with Mordor in melee, and I think Mirkwood realises that. So what they're going to try and do is shoot us on the approach. Units like Morroquendi bows, Doran Ernil pikemen are going to be very squishy targets indeed. The Selduin River Patrol getting into melee with Elder Council, coming to the aid of the Olakai. Mordor shutting these units of archers down, which is very nice. Morroquendi bows getting in here as well. They may be skirmishers that are out of ammunition. The Selduin River Patrol are useless in melee near enough. But just adding some support to them, Olakai. The Morroquendi bows are substantially better in melee, of course, very much the equivalent of the Mirkwood archers in melee. So while Dorwinion are able to sort of get there ahead of me, Selduin River Patrol getting into the River Patrol over there. The Glade Masters certainly being the focus of the Elven units' attentions. But I'm going to try and get my Athlon men-at-arms around here. They're already shaken though. So I'm really hoping that my morale holds itself together. Of course, I lost my general earlier on. I don't have any inspiration units left to me. So morale is going to be an issue for me here in the late game when facing down the Mirkwood Elves. But where the cavalry was previously, you can see that the Nandor Glade Riders are going to charge in, a sandwich between them and the Athlon men-at-arms. And as if that wasn't enough, the Hiri Pang are going to be chased off by the Perithal champion. So as long as we can keep Mirkwood running away and not shooting, we'll be able to sort of pick apart their army piece by piece. The Elders of the Elven King are here right in the middle of the line, which is pretty much the strongest unit of infantry left in the game. So that's going to be a problem, but hopefully we can use the pikes to hold them in place and do the damage elsewhere. The Doran Ernil swordsmen rout, but as I mentioned, they will come back. We need to shut down these crossbows as well, because if those crossbows get just a few good volleys, particularly on my infantry, it will break at this point. The Nandor Glade Riders, this unit of Nandor Glade Riders is still alive, as well as a few Glade Lords, which they've managed to sort of keep themselves alive after being involved in the Valley of Death. And now, with a lot of the Mirkwood skirmishers tied now, that unit of 18 Nandor Glade Riders will honestly be a real boon for us. You can see here the Athlon Men-at-Arms killing off what's left of the Greenwood Rangers after they got charged. Here we have the Hiri Peng facing off against the Perithil champions. I think the champions should win that. They have a slight numbers advantage and they are dedicated infantry. I suppose they are winded though, whereas the Hiri Peng are fresh. Could be a very decisive difference there. The Orc Javelins throwing at point blank range is so close at this point. Really it comes down to the fact if my infantry can not break, I've got some Dora and Ernil archers there just picking and poking at what's left of Mirkwood as well. If my infantry doesn't break, we should win this, just because they don't really have a ready-made answer for the pikes at this point. And of course Sin's cavalry is still running around also. But my infantry breaking is a very real possibility at this point. The Olag Kai has thrown itself into the crossbows to stop them from firing. The Dora and Ernil swordsmen are on their way over as well. They won't last too long in melee against the crossbows, but just stopping them from firing for as long as possible is going to be the key. The Athlon Men-at-Arms at this point just trying to finish off that last ranger. The Glade Lords charging into the rear of the Hiri Peng just in time to allow me to turn around with my Perithil champions and meet the charge of the other unit of Hiri Peng, meaning I won't get rear charged, and that will of course mean that Sin's cavalry can wheel around and try and charge into the rear of that unit of Hiri Peng as well. And you can see at this point the Mirkwood forces, the Elder Council were trying to fire their javelins, but ultimately at this point they're going to get into melee here, and as if that wasn't enough, my Dora and Ernil archers now have a perfect shot into their backs, so the revenge of the Dora and Ernil units here after being bullied in the early game by the Mirkwood skirmishers, they are now going to be just another part of the downfall of Mirkwood here. And you can see here a rear charge of the Elven King closing the jaws, my Athlon Men-at-Arms coming in here. My pikemen are also going to start to work up the line. My pikes are shaken, and this is the problem. The fact that a lot of my infantry is not the most resolute. My pikes are being attacked in the back by the Elder Council after all. And I think, yep, my Athlon Men-at-Arms are actually going to break there. They do manage to kill Thranduil before they break. They kill Thranduil and then they run for the hills. Rather interesting time to rout, but it doesn't really matter at this point. I mean, while if these morale shocks had happened slightly earlier, Mirkwood probably would have been able to fight their way out of this, but as it is, I mean, with Sin's cavalry still here, and there's simply too many pikes at this point for them to deal with. But a very, very close fight, and I mean, for the longest time in that battle, it looked like we were just going to get systematically crushed across the field. But our hilltop defence against the hobbits really turned things around. I think Sin deserves a huge amount of credit for that, because the way he used his Nandor Glade Lords, or Glade Riders, because they're a unit which if you use them wrong, they'll die very, very quickly. But that was them being used at their very, very best. And that allowed us the strength to then go forward and meet Mirkwood. And honestly, while Mirkwood's army was, pretty horrendous for me to deal with in the early game, the fact that Frodo was not able to support Erebor in sort of an infantry capacity was certainly to Erebor's detriment. Because eventually their army was pretty much entirely destroyed apart from their crossbows by a combination of my cavalry, but particularly Mordor's infantry. I think Mordor deserves a lot of credit for how they dealt with Erebor's infantry. My cavalry was really just there to try and draw the fire of the Mirkwood skirmishers, which is not the traditional role for high-tier cavalry, but in this case, you make do with what you have, I suppose. I definitely think Sin was the MVP here, though. I mean, the use of those Glade Riders was really what turned the fight in our favour, because they killed the hobbits so fast, and that is the downside to playing as the hobbits ultimately. They don't have the best defensive values. They will run if they get caught in a disadvantageous engagement, which they certainly were. They were charging uphill into my pikes and Sin's javelins, and then of course the cavalry was also doing its thing, as well as the Glade Masters. The hobbits really had no answer to that. The Proudfoot protectors were ripped to pieces. Mirkwood got the most kills on the field, which is not terribly surprising. They're facing down against a very numbers-heavy Mordor army, and of course my cavalry, which was very ill-suited to fight in this sort of terrain against that sort of army. But I still feel as though that composition ultimately worked against them, because, again, it's more of a meme-y army, I get it, but it didn't work out in the end. And this is pretty much the ideal situation for a full skirmisher army to happen as well. They had the ideal defensive position. They were up against a very cavalry-heavy army, which their stakes, and of course, you know, the fact that they would have been able to javelin and arrow me to death on the approach. You know, it was ideal for this sort of army composition, and it still didn't really work. The javelins, of course, you know, going to be a big factor. Early on, Imladris and the Shire really did rush down Eclipse a lot. Eclipse did manage to kill a decent amount of troops, to be honest, considering the horrible position he found himself in. But ultimately, he was the one that was eliminated early on. But yeah, it was a very back and forth fight. It was an interesting one to be a part of. I thought it was going to go very one-sided early on, but we managed to fight our way back into it. So it's a case of never give up, never say die, and you may very well be able to turn it around. So having a look at what did the damage for me, my army by no means was standout in terms of kills. I was very much the again late on. I was, like I said, the anvil to Sin's hammer. But my cavalry, which was where I was hoping to do a lot of damage, I mean, to be fair, 78 on Swan Knights, 93 on Haven Knights. The cavalry didn't do as much damage as I really wanted it to, which is not surprising. I mean, it was always going to be difficult in this sort of situation with that sort of terrain to do damage with cavalry, and in the end I had to sort of use them as a shield. It's very rare that you'll see Knights of the Silver Swan sort of sacrificing themselves so that orcs may live, but that was what was happening here. One of my units of Belfast Marines did terribly, but what the other unit did very well. So that's 108 kills on primarily Elven units. So again, that's another nice little supporting unit that we did. But again, that was part of the fighting retreat that we were engaged in. But Imladris didn't have much left after that rush. So you know, that unit, also Sin's archers, I imagine, probably did quite well for themselves, considering they're usually quite defensive. That sort of thing is one of the reasons why the elves had very little left when it came to assaulting the hill, and it's why we were able to rip the hobbits to pieces. If Imladris had more left, it would have been more difficult for Sin to really carve into the hobbits as well as he did. My Perithil champions, though, were my MVPs, alongside my pikes. Obviously, the pikes in the late game are really what secured us the victory, but my Perithil champions as well, carving their way through the hobbits, the fear also really helping, and also being able to go toe-to-toe with those Mirkwood archers in the late game. So yeah, very interesting fight this. It's an interesting map as well. I feel as though the deployment zones, it was not intentional for the Imladris elves and hobbits to be able to deploy on that side of the cliff. But even so, it still worked out in a very interesting manner. Again, Frodo's composition, I would not recommend you take that in the vast majority of situations because it will not work. I mean, this was pretty much the ideal situation for it here, and it still didn't really work. I mean, it wasn't really what his team needed. I mean, a mostly skirmisher army with a few units of infantry, maybe even a few units of cavalry, that would be a different matter. But as it is, it didn't really work out for them in the end. A victory for us, just about. So yeah, this was an interesting battle to be a part of, to say the very least. North versus South, and in this case, the South won. The next battle I show, I don't know, it would probably be a siege of some description. I do have quite a few sort of very long sieges that I could show. There's one on Bur-Sagath, there's one on Moria, I'm not quite sure, but we'll see. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.